Thank you for joining us today, Doug. It's a pleasure to see you. I've always enjoyed our conversations one-on-one, and I'm really delighted to be the person interviewing you for Society 2045. Your list of accomplishments is really long, and so if I ask you to start talking about yourself, I know you could fill the entire time, but can you give us a really brief thumbnail sketch of a few things that you've done and what you're working on now? Just take a couple minutes on that so we have a sense of who you are.
Well, at one point I was involved with electronics and the early stuff that turned into the internet. And I got invited to do a network for Al Gore's Reinventing Government National Performance Review. It was a big deal, and it led to then connections all around the world and a lot of consulting. And it was in Washington, D.C., so at the same time I had a private practice of psychoanalysis and was getting to see people inside the administration in a therapeutic context and learned a great deal. Most of what I've done in a certain way follows from that. Yeah, okay, so I'm at Stanford, involved in a program that dealt with climate change and with Paul Ehrlich. And I realized Paul Ehrlich wasn't interested in listening to anybody. He just wanted people to pay attention to what he'd already said. But in doing it, I followed a lot of the climate people and realized that they had a very naive view of the economy, basically thinking that if people changed their consumer habits, this is 10 years ago, it would solve the problem. That seemed to me just wrong, because I could see that people were going to lose their jobs, the economy is going to restructure, and that people weren't talking about that. A friend of mine became president of George Soros's Institute for New Economic Thinking at that point, Rob Johnson. I called him up and I said, Rob, I need to know about economics. How do I do that? And he said, we do too, come join us. So I became the strategist for that organization. And it's been an extraordinary education, because economics is almost incapable of moving out of its own narrow circle for reasons that are quite understandable. They want formal systems. Formal systems don't work if you break the frame. So they don't want to break the frame so they can keep doing calculations. Anyway, basically what I've done has followed from that. I started to write a book, which started out being called The 80% Solution, because I was convinced there was an agenda that 80% of the population would vote for if it was offered to them, but it wasn't going to be offered. But there were other books coming along I knew that had percent in the title, so I wanted to drop that and came up with GardenWorld Politics as my own thinking was going. So a lot of the recent years have been back and forth between practice, nudging the Institute for New Economic Thinking to be a little more forthright, and working on the book, which I posted up in Snapchat last week. So that's kind of fun. That's probably an okay beginning.
That's a terrific beginning. I can't help but notice some of the artwork behind you, and I know that you're a painter, so I'm assuming that's your own. Is that correct?
It is. That's across the river from the house.
I was going to say, so being a painter and an author of GardenWorld Politics, and knowing that this is about looking at the world in 2045, can you paint a picture for us of what the world might look like in 2045, knowing that there's a whole bunch of challenge to get over between now and then, but looking down the road and assuming that we're successful in instituting GardenWorld, what kind of things can we expect?
Well, the reason I wanted to do this interview was I think the idea of 2045 is really important. One of the things about our time is people have almost no imagination as to what a better society could look like. Maybe fairness, but it's pretty vague. They don't look at the contradictions in that. So now, can I paint a picture of 2045? Here's my strategy. I think we're in a period which is characterized by what Stephen Jay Gould called punctuated equilibrium. You have an environment which is relatively in quasi-equilibrium, like most environments are. Then something happens outside, and everybody in the environment needs to mutate in order to respond to the changes. So you get the apparent spread of all sorts of emergence happening simultaneously. And I think that's where we are. We're going to see a lot of emergence. It's kind of like where a river breaks into a delta with lots of little streams going in every direction. So I can't pick out what I think is going to happen, but I can pick out what I would like to see happen. So that's where I go. And we learn as children that you solve problems by breaking them into pieces and working on the pieces. It's totally wrong, because the forces that create the problems lie outside those narrow definitions. So what seemed to me, and I'm leaving out a lot of steps because it took time to think it through, is that if you solve several problems at the same time, you might get more leverage. So it occurred to me that the two key problems that were obvious about 2045 is food and habitat. We have to live somewhere, and our big houses are not going to be heatable, so we're going to be out of there. The food is under pressure everywhere. People are going to have to pay attention. And then it occurred to me, going back to readings that I had done 20 years ago, with things like the arts and crafts movement in America in the 1880s and 90s, Ruskin and Mumford, people like that, thinking kind of romantically about a reconstructed humanity living in a slightly simpler world. But the key thing that comes out of that reading is aesthetics. So if you do habitat and food together and make it aesthetic, that is, it's a continual requirement to do the best to make it as attractive as possible. I'll give an example. I have a friend who unfortunately died a couple of years ago, Jim Shannon, on the Big Island in Hawaii. Some of you probably know Jim. And he has a farm at the north end of the island, which is wonderful because there's nothing linear in it. It's all circles. The food is grown in circles, and there's a grass path around the interstices between the circles. And it's just beautiful, just simply by rearranging it and breaking up the rows. So I think that there's a lot of difficulties in thinking of GardenWorld. One of them is, first of all, you've got to deal with the fact that currently we've got 8 billion people, and that's probably going to be different by 2045, or we're going to have rethought it in some kind of creative new way. But it's certainly a problem. Another thing with GardenWorld is it can't leave out technology. My image is kind of that we have villages that are fun to live in and creative and meet our needs, but they're interconnected by the internet where we can learn from each other. But the internet does not become the power center that it is now, controlling the flow of dollars and all that. We've got to break that apart. So that's kind of a beginning of my image. If you think of the Italian hill towns where you walk out of your house and you're immediately 3 steps away from the top end of your field where you go vegetables. It's a safe place for children to play. It's a good place for pets. It's a good place for old people to wander around and get to the cafe, which is only 100 yards away. This is an image that I think is really attractive and meets human nature where it actually is.
I love this image, and I love the emphasis on imagination. It seems one of the challenges we're in right now is as you say, there's so much focus on problems. And in my work as a consultant, I try to encourage people to recognize that how do we fix things is a problem, is a question for later. First, it's like, what would it look like if it was working? So that we engage our imagination in saying, how does it look if it was working for everybody? So I'm really curious, the title of GardenWorld, and you just alluded to it a little bit about, it seems like there's almost a permaculture aspect of, I love the idea of walking out my door and being in an edible landscape and being close to things. What are some of the other aspects of GardenWorld that are going to be really stimulating people's imagination in a way that's going to light them up?
Well, since you've got to do everything there, one of them is the issue of governance and how that works. I don't know how many, most of you probably know about open space and Harrison Owen and the way he does that. So I liked, and this is a way of cutting through the cash economy to something else. So if you can imagine the community, it gathers in a big circle in the morning, and we get a kind of update as to where things are, what's happening with food, what's happening with water or whatever. And then the issue is, what do you guys want to work on? Write it on a piece of paper and go tack it on the wall. And then we'll have signups for those groups. So if something comes up like we've got to get the junk off the roads from the earthquake, and people volunteer for that, and somebody says, but they got to eat. So somebody says, okay, I'll volunteer to take on the food issue. I'm making it way too short, but the techniques are wonderful at distributing new authority in the group. And the only things that get done are things that people want to do. If they don't want to do it, it falls off the list. So it keeps the community evolving. And you start out every morning with this group. I'm being a little too schematic, but I think you know what I'm saying. And it's sociable. It's interesting because you see people taking initiatives you wouldn't have expected. I've had a lot of experience with this. I once did open space with Harrison with 450 people for 4 days, and it worked. It really was amazing. So I think we could run garden space with that. So to answer your question, this new element of doing governance in a more creative and interesting way is one of the elements.
A lot of self-organizing that has to go into this. And I'm always interested in self-organizing from the standpoint of which self are we organizing? You know, there's my own needs, and then there's the needs of my interpersonal relationships and the needs of the community around us. So in addition to open space, are there some other things that can help? Like you said, it doesn't get done if people don't want to do it, but no one wants to take out the trash. No one wants to clean up the messes. And yet if that's not handled, it becomes a challenge. So
well, one of the things you notice about an open space is if the garbage needs to be taken out, actually somebody will volunteer to do that, because people are highly motivated by meeting the real needs of the community. They take pleasure in that, pride, and it gives them status in the community. It's the things that don't need to be done that we get anxious about that might fall off the list. And I think that's very creative.
So what other dimensions of GardenWorld should we be looking at as a way to stimulate our imaginations towards creating a world in 2045 that is working, that's livable, that is where we see cities getting safer and environments getting cleaner and people treating each other more kindly with greater compassion?
Well, you've added things like the cities getting whatever. I'm leery about the future of cities. They need to be fed. Who's going to do that? Agriculture has been subordinated to the city in terms of income and status. I think that has to come apart, and the cities are not so attractive. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in Asia in the last 5 years through INET, and to see these cities with 60 and 80-story apartment buildings that people get moved out of their villages into these places, and they're terrible. So I just am questioning the future of cities. Somebody mentioned, I think you mentioned permaculture. If you look at the typical photographs of permaculture projects and most agricultural experiments, there's no people in them. They're really industrializing production, even if it's fairly local. I think that putting people in the scene as part of their life for pleasure and work is going to make things easier along that dimension. Now, part of the problem is, which is serious, is that many places in the world, maybe a majority, are not capable of the kind of self-sustaining economy that GardenWorld calls out for. So I think what we need to do is to work on the places where it can and work on the support for the people who are left out. So I think that along with a widely distributed technology using the internet, we need a widely distributed new form of social welfare to help out people. I used the phrase a few weeks ago, each one save one. Remember, we used to have each one teach one. If everybody was thinking of the person they know of who's in the worst situation and try and help them, and just make that the ethic and the pleasure of living in the evolving world.
I love that. I was on a call the other day, and the one who wrote The Optimist Telescope was speaking, and she said, we need to engage empathic imagination. And I just love this phrase, empathic imagination. It's very, it's easy to read about people in far off lands and think, oh yeah, they're abstract. But empathic imagination is when we actually sense into what it's like to be living in a world where the circumstances are very different. I've been on some calls recently with people from Africa, and hearing on the ground what it's like to be there has given me a much greater appreciation for that. So how can we use some of the technology that you're talking about, the connectivity, to help engage empathic imagination?
Well, the first thing about technology is currently it's terrible because it's owned by a few people. And so they reap the profits of that. We've got to have a different approach to the ownership and the management of technology. And I think let's go, if we go back 2 years when I was trying to draft out GardenWorld, I left technology out of the picture, and that just became quixotically impossible. So the thing is, how does it come in? So I imagine let's just be a little abstract of it. We've got these little garden worlds all over the world, and they're interconnected with the internet. And most of the rest of the technology turns out to be useless. The solar grid, for example, because the grid can be done locally and we don't need to do all that. I think the future will be with the villages using artificial intelligence to manage the distribution of resources in relation to real emerging needs as local communities find themselves in trouble. So it becomes a help welfare network primarily, it should not go along the line of trying to distribute food from industrial agriculture, which would be one tendency. How to break into the ownership pattern of current technology is a real problem, because of course it reinforces the neo-feudalism of the large corporations. Mm-hmm. And I just want to see that come slowly apart. Well, that's the hope.
So as it comes slowly apart, what do you see weaving together on the other side that's going to be better?
Well, it would be the simple use of the internet and artificial intelligence to manage resources in a way that's fair and responds to real crisis needs, not to simple opportunities. Simple opportunities should be explored locally with emergent solutions, and we can all learn from each other. So I see the network as being a learning environment, not a power environment. So if we think of it as welfare and learning, and I think a lot of people in the technology community would like that approach. Breaking the money out. So one of the things I wanted to mention and slip it into this conversation somewhere is the idea of capitalism and capital. It gets totally mystified. Capitalism is really simple. It means that the surplus produced by a community is owned by some in that community and not everybody in that community. Mm-hmm. And it's a real ripoff, and it always has been since the early empires when people were forced to give up hunter-gathering and become slaves in settlement communities. We can just do better than that.
It's interesting you mentioned um, the farm with the circles. And there's a fellow I know, you probably know him too from the Open Gold Mine calls, Michael Winton, who talks about circular money, that we live in a world of linear money where, you spend money and it does not come back to you. And in a circular money, in a circular economy, what you spend comes back around to you and enriches you. So do you have any sense of how that's going to emerge and what that looks like? I'm assuming if
Well,
you're writing about Garden World, you're also including currency and money in here too.
well, the title for the book includes, so it's GardenWorld Politics. And the reason politics is in there is I think we cannot get to a better future without political activity. And politics includes strikes, revolts. The idea that getting the policy right will get us anywhere, I think, is just wrong. It's got to be much more activist.
Mhm.
So I lost your question. Can you come back to it?
Yeah, it's about circular money and
Oh, yeah.
currency and
I can see why I left that out. Because instead of hoping that the money goes away, the money was created in Greece to raise taxes. It was a simpler way of collecting taxes than having collecting the grain. Money, why do we need it? In an open, if we use open space to manage our community, this distribution of resources and needed work just happens. And the rest of it falls out. A lot of the stuff we use money for, if it was discretionary, we wouldn't do. So I don't know, that's not a typically good answer to the question,
it's okay.
but
Well, let me pick on you for a moment about artificial intelligence. It's a very controversial topic for a lot of people. I recently read a book called Sex, Race, and Robots, written by a African American roboticist who teaches at MIT. Um, AI currently is far outweighed by natural stupidity, and there's a long way to go to actually develop really a robust artificial intelligence that does not have built into it the same racist and sexist assumptions that so much of our other behavior does. But assuming we can get to the point where we're really programming AI well, it seems to me one of the biggest advantages is that it's not subject as much to unconscious bias as humans are. As far as I can tell, unconscious bias is a feature, not a bug in our consciousness. So when we bring AI in to look at how to grow communities sustainably and help them to be flourishing and thriving, what do you see the role of AI augmenting there that we can't do on our own? How does that look to you?
well, the first thing is to start with what's happening to AI, which is it's an extension of the capitalist system, which means concentrating power and wealth. And that's gotta go. So I think that I mean, AI, first of all, I think humanity will not give up on technology. It's too romantically interesting. People are going to want to play with it. And so using it, I think I'm going to repeat myself here, but the answer is distribution of resources under real need, not under desire. And learning how our experiments are going locally so we learn from each other. That's my view. It's not it's not a governance instrument because that gives too much power. I want the governance in the local communities. Now we have some amazing problems ahead. Will we be able to manufacture the stuff that allows us to do the internet in 2045? Are we going to run out of energy or run out of lithium or run out of something? There's a lot of effort going into working on substitutes already. I think they'll be fairly successful. but it's certainly going to be a problem, especially if we find ourselves not able to produce a lot of electricity. Then we can't manufacture solar panels. The depth of the breakdown, well, I'm going to lead into another topic here. Most people that I know want the government or the corporations to come up with ways of dealing with climate change that get us from our 60% good life now to an 80% good life without going through a down phase. I don't think it's possible. I think we're going to start seeing failures in supply chains, in energy distribution. Those things have cascading effects, which are going to affect the manufacturability of the standard technologies. I can see a time when we don't have the resources to make computers. The amount of coordination they require are just too high. And wow, that's a different ballgame. If we move in that direction, having GardenWorld as a strategy seems to be a good fallback position.
Great. Well, I've pretty much gone through my list of questions. I know we've got several attentive listeners on the call here. I'd like to open it up if it's appropriate to do so and ask if they've got some questions for you. Stewart, do your worst.
I'm going to try to do my worst. Thank you. So Doug, I greatly appreciate your remarks, your thought, your visions, and your thinking. And I especially like you mentioning Harrison Owen. I can remember sitting with him by the banks of the Potomac and just having some wonderful conversations. So I love the imagery that you posed for GardenWorld. It's kind of like a heaven on earth concept, which resonates with me deeply. The real short question that I have is to shift from the capitalist mentality that we're all in is going to take essentially a complete change in consciousness, and the human element is what's there. I mean, I think in some sense we know that we don't have a resource challenge on Earth. We have a distribution challenge. I'm not saying to live the kind of lives we're currently living, but living some kind of life in the future that is sustainable. So what's your sense? And I've always had this vision of human beings on a conveyor belt, and a bell jar comes down and somebody gongs the bell jar, and people come out, able to participate in society. Given your background and the depth that you have in this area, what comments or thoughts do you have about that?
Well, all over the place, as you can imagine. Let's start with, we get a breakdown in the food supply. Drivers don't show up to drive the trucks because they're home taking care of their families in a crisis situation. So our little town has no food. I imagine everybody coming out in the street and greeting each other with a lot of anxiety. And somebody says, holy shit, what the fuck do we do now? So you've already got a community because there's a bunch of people standing in the street, and we organize from there. And I think the intent needs to be to make sure that every move we make is as attractive as possible, as a way of supporting this nascent community. Part of the story of capitalism is I think it will just turn out to be not attractive and it will die. Now that's a long shot, but one of the places we can help people like us is with good narratives about what capitalism is. So I started out by, that the problem with capitalism, it's simply community surplus owned by some and not by others. And they get to make decisions which ought to be political or are being done economically. Now, one way to support this story is to understand where capitalism comes from. It's an amazing story, but it begins with the word capital comes from cap, head, as in a new head of cattle. So capitalism began as recognizing that the herd produced a surplus. So the herd was larger next to this year than last year. And the question then is, who owns the surplus? It was already an issue in the very earliest communities. What's amazing is the word economics. Eco is Greek for house, and nomos for law, or what the Greeks treated it really as management. So it was estate management was the Greek meaning. But the nomos, which was treated as just management by the time of Plato, a century earlier and earlier than that, meant equal distribution. That was the law. You don't have a law if there isn't a social need. And the early Greek law was dealing with how you maintain the equality of hunter-gatherer societies when you start settling down. And there were interesting things. In the beginning, people recognized that the wealth, they didn't call it that, was in the herd and the increase of the herd. But with increasing population, you found people beginning to get anxious and conflicting about the grazing space. So the Greeks thought, aha, okay, so we've got to make that fair. So they started making these long chains and laying out squares. And this square is your square, and this square is my square. And somebody said, hey, wait a minute. Yours has got this wonderful marshy stuff, and ours is nothing but rocks. So how do you do it fairly? Well, nobody could solve that problem, but the discussion was there. And basically, the early capitalism is about how you distribute, manage the increased productivity of the society. Now, there are two interesting sidelights here. One is that surplus, Plato and Aristotle, among other Greeks, said, okay, if we can produce a surplus by managing the estate well, what's the purpose of it? Said, well, the purpose of the surplus should be to create leisure time so we can have conversations in politics. So that was the purpose of the surplus. It wasn't, and Aristotle and Plato were both very clear that increasing consumerism is not a good use of surplus. So here we have a discussion that could be made very contemporary now. What happened historically is fascinating. The idea of estate management and the production of surplus became part of the working vocabulary of the early monastic movement. And the view was, this is God's land, it's his estate, and it's our job to manage it in order to produce his ends, which is that we become decent people through prayer and meditation. So the surplus had a purpose. So you get that tradition which comes up through the whole monastic world. And the monastic world, in order to create more surplus so they could have more time for leisure in the sense of study and prayer, developed new agricultural processes. So ways of using the plow, of dealing with crop rotation, all that. Really rich stuff, which then became a resource to Western society as the monastic world broke down under the pressures of increased population. Well, this story kind of naturalizes what capitalism is and says, hey guys, we can rethink this for our purposes. Let's have that conversation. What the fuck is the surplus to be used for? Let's think about it rather than going out and buying another BMW. That's my take on capitalism.
Yeah, great. So what I hear you saying, Doug, is that people will change in the face of absolute need or crisis.
Or hey, your grass is greener than my grass. I want to go over there. And by grass, I mean, you guys have much more fun around the dinner table than we do. What are you doing differently than what we do? Okay. And people will learn that way. And the capital stuff will get re-socialized, renaturalized.
I watched a movie this week called Defiance, and it was a true story from the Holocaust about three brothers from Byelorussian who created a community in the forest to hide from the Nazis. And it was like, listening to the dialogue was kind of prophetic in terms of a dystopian world that's a possibility as I see it, in terms of the actions that were going on. Any thoughts about that phenomenon?
Well, boy, I think that we need to rethink what happened with Germany and with fascism. Again, it's a question of sort of naturalizing the story. What people did makes sense. It wasn't a bunch of bad people. It was a bunch of difficult culture that we all helped create. I mean, Germany was poverty-stricken, deeply hurt by the economy. Just like Japan, it created the conditions for World War I and II based on economic need, which is created by trying to keep up with Europe and the United States. That puts things in a very different light. An anecdote. I read a memoir by a Japanese guy who had been captured by the Russians and put in a prisoner of war camp in Russia, in Siberia, along with a bunch of Germans. And he said, us Japanese in the camp were so depressed, but every night the Germans would get together and sing. And it was beautiful. And it changed the morale of the whole camp. Well, that says something about German culture. That's powerful. We've got to get out of the demonizing this. And what any human being does makes sense from their point of view. So it's a question of empathy and conversation and education as the key intents of what we're doing with each other.
Thank you.
That was beautiful, Doug. That leads into the question that I wanted to ask. I was afraid Stewart was going to ask it before I did. But that leads right into it, which is part of what I'm hearing is the idea that what you're really suggesting is that we become interdependent once again on one another, that it's through that level of interdependence where if I'm the one that needs to clean something up or you're the one that needs to clean something up, then I now owe you something, and vice versa. We're now connected in this human way, which is, I think, what I'm hearing when you say we need to get that.
Let me cut in here. What we owe each other, I'm hoping, is not part of the way it goes. That there's a kind of implicit accounting there. It's if the garbage needs to be picked up, hell, I'll volunteer to do that. There's no sense of owing. It's a sense of responding.
But don't you think that that's human nature, that our sense of equality, if you will, that when I help you, that that automatically I'm connected to you because of that, and vice versa?
You're bringing in the idea of the individual.
Yes.
In early human society, people were communities. The idea of individual didn't exist. It's a latecomer. It basically comes through late Christianity. I don't think about my doing the garbage as for a person. I think of my doing it for the community, and the community is going to appreciate the fact that I did it. That's where it goes. So it's a different culture, but I don't think it's going to be too hard to get there. I mean, look, kids in summer camp do it. Adults on vacation, meeting on a beach somewhere, do amazingly cooperative things together. I think people kind of get it. Yeah, and it's just the individual is not the way to think about this. I mean, obviously we're in a phase of history where we've already got individuals. So how to think about it? It goes like this. You cannot have a strong community without strong individuals. You cannot have strong individuals without a strong community. It's not either or, it's both. They go together.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. I pass on to Kim.
So, Doug, you probably don't know that you have 3 lawyers in this group, and we're all a different breed of lawyer who we're all working towards a different kind of legal system. And so I invite my colleagues to jump in and if they want to have part of this discussion. But you said you don't have a law unless there's a social need. And I would like for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, if there isn't a need, there's no motive. So the early Greeks were motivated by trying to figure out how we maintain equality. In hunter-gatherer society, as soon as there's a kill, it's shared. No question about it. As people began to settle down, that culture came under pressure and people wanted to try and maintain it. So they did the incredible thing of inventing the idea of the sacrifice. So the settled community has a sacrifice. The smoke goes to the gods and the meat goes to the people. If you read things like Homer's Odyssey, when they landed on an island, they would kill a hectocomb of cattle, that's 100, and distribute it to everybody. Athens actually was much more like an Argentinian cattle ranch than a modern vegetable planted farm. That the meat was the major part of the diet of the people. I'll just stop there. Well, maybe I won't, because I mean, the question is, where does the law come from? The law comes from trying to work out what fairness means in a complicated world where things are really so different from each other, including the different pieces of land, the different talents of the people, the different ages of the people. The problem of what do you do with prisoners of war? Well, we could kill them or we can turn them into slaves. Hey, which is the more humane? These are the kinds of issues that people faced and will continue to face. And I think we will need law and regulation in garden world, but it should be responsive to real needs. Lawyers today, when you pass the bar and you become certified to practice, you take an oath to be an agent of the state. How many lawyers treat that as something as part of their commission to do? They're out looking for their high-paying clients as soon as they can. One of the things about Athens that's amazing, we think we do something called democracy, voting. Voting for the Greeks was a pathology of democracy. Democracy meant the people rule. How did it work? Lots were drawn every year to determine who had what jobs in the bureaucracy. So if you got to be a tax collector, that's what your job was for a year. Now, there's several implications. One is that you have to have a very high level of education because anybody could win the lottery and you want them to be smart enough to be able to do the job. The Greeks had amazingly intense education. Everything, rhetoric, music, gymnastics, astronomy, and so on. My hidden assumption is that we're going to go through a much more severe breakdown. Things like transportation and energy will cease to be the commodities that they are and will be used in a very discretionary way to meet real needs. You know, everybody's been in a happy mood in this conversation, so it's hard to go back to some of the realities that are in the way. I think we are going to face increasing temperature with all the consequences of that. Failure of agriculture in many places, the failure of the oceans to produce fish in quantity. It's going to be really rough. And that there will be surviving communities kind of thinking of Africans meeting the Ice Age, where we're smart and survive, but boy, it's a struggle. And we're not going to be interested in things like flying hydrogen-fueled planes. It just drops out. It's not part of the picture. Now, I realize that that's kind of abstract and a little bit of a romantic view. But I think that I mean, what do we do about the increasing temperature? We do not have the leverage to prevent it, And it doesn't go to 1.5 or 2.5 degrees. It keeps on going. That means the interstices where human life is going to be possible are going to be narrowing.
Doug, thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. I feel like we could go on for several more hours, and maybe someday we can all get together and do that. But for today, it's time to cap it. It's been a delight to listen to you and see you, and I thank everybody else who's been on the call and contributed. Jose, do you have any closing words? No, we're good.
And I just say the book got posted at on SubChat. And you can find it douglascarmichael.subchat.com. And Douglas is spelt with 2 S's and no space between that and Carmichael.
Okay, everybody got that? All right. Thank you all. Have a great long weekend. It's Labor Day already. I don't know how that happened, but we'll see you possibly next week or at another future dialogue. Wishing you all the best.